40 seconds. That is all the time that remains inside the control room of reactor number 4, where a young engineer is standing over the one button designed to make a nuclear reactor safe: the emergency shutdown. In 40 seconds, he will press it, and instead of stopping the reactor, it will help tear the building apart. To understand how the ultimate safety device became a trigger, we need to go back to the previous afternoon, April 25, 1986, in Soviet Ukraine. This is the Countdown Archive. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was one of the proudest achievements of the Soviet Union. 4 giant RBMK reactors on the banks of the Pripyat River, with a purpose-built city of nearly 50,000 people just a few kilometers away. Young families drawn from across the country to one of the best-supplied towns in the USSR. And on that April afternoon, reactor number 4 was due for something routine: a safety test. The question it was meant to answer was simple and reasonable. If the plant ever lost electrical power, the massive pumps pushing cooling water through the core would stop, and the emergency diesel generators needed the better part of a minute to take over, a gap during which the core would be starved of circulation. The engineers wanted to prove that the slowing turbine, still spinning on pure momentum, could power the pumps long enough to bridge that gap. The test had been attempted before, and it had never worked. This time, it was scheduled for the afternoon shift, the crew that had prepared for it. Then the phone rang. In the early afternoon, as the reactor was already being powered down, the electrical grid controller in Kyiv asked the plant to keep generating. Another power station had gone offline, and the region needed electricity through the evening. The shutdown was frozen where it stood for more than 9 hours, and one of the emergency cooling systems, already disconnected as part of the test procedure, stayed disconnected while the reactor kept running. When permission finally came, near midnight, the test no longer belonged to the engineers who had planned it. It now belonged to the night shift. At the reactor controls, Leonid Toptanov, an engineer in his mid-20s with only a few months in the job. Beside him, shift supervisor Alexander Akimov, and behind them both, the deputy chief engineer of the plant, Anatoly Dyatlov, a hard, impatient man determined that the test would be completed that night, whatever it took. At 28 minutes past midnight, it started to go wrong. During the handover to a different power control system, the reactor's output collapsed, not to the level the test required, but almost to nothing. 30 megawatts, barely 1% of its capacity. A reactor in that state begins poisoning itself, as a byproduct called xenon builds up in the core and smothers the nuclear reaction like wet ash on a fire. The safe answer, and the one the procedures pointed to, was to shut down and try again another day. Instead, the control rods, the reactor's brakes, were pulled out of the core, one group after another, to drag the power back up. By 1 in the morning, they had clawed their way to about 200 megawatts, still far below what the test called for, and by 22 minutes past 1, the plant's own computer printed a warning. The margin of inserted rods had fallen to the equivalent of 8, when the minimum permitted was 15. It was formal grounds for an immediate shutdown. The test went ahead anyway. What none of the men in that control room fully understood was that their reactor was hiding 2 flaws, and that they had just armed both of them. The RBMK had what engineers call a positive void coefficient. When the cooling water inside it turned to steam, the nuclear reaction did not slow down, as in Western designs. It sped up. And its control rods, the brakes themselves, were tipped with graphite, so that in the first moment of their insertion, they did not reduce the reaction at all. They briefly boosted it, from the bottom of the core upward. That defect had already been observed at a sister plant 3 years earlier. It was never fixed, and the operators were never told. The reactor they thought they were taming was a loaded trap. At 1:23 and 4 seconds, the test began. The steam valves feeding the turbine were closed, and the great machine began to coast down, its momentum feeding 4 of the 8 cooling pumps exactly as planned. As the pumps slowed, the water in the core moved more sluggishly, lingering, heating, flashing into steam, and in this reactor, steam meant power. Deep inside the core, hidden from the instrument's smoothed readings, the reaction was beginning to climb. At 1:23:40, someone in the control room pressed the emergency button. The button known as AZ5, full shutdown, every control rod driving into the core at once. 200 graphite tips entered the reaction zone together, and the power did not fall. It leapt. 3 seconds later, the alarms registered a surge past 500 megawatts and climbing beyond anything the instruments could follow. Later estimates put the peak at roughly 10 times the reactor's normal output. The rods jammed a third of the way down. The men at the panel felt heavy shocks shaking the building. And then the fuel itself shattered. The water flashed to steam in an instant, and a steam explosion threw the reactor's 1,000-ton lid into the air. 2 or 3 seconds later, a second, larger explosion followed. The roof of Reactor 4 was gone, and the core of a nuclear reactor lay open to the night sky. In the control room, choked with dust, the men refused to believe what the gauges implied, because in every manual and every classroom of their careers, an RBMK reactor could not explode. Akimov kept repeating that the reactor was intact, and cooling water was pumped for hours into a core that no longer existed. One operator died in the collapsing pump hall that night, and his body was never found. Another died of his burns within hours. On the roofs and around the building, chunks of hot graphite lay scattered in the darkness, pieces of the core itself. The firefighters who arrived within minutes, led by a 23-year-old lieutenant named Volodymyr Pravik, climbed toward the glow with hoses and no warning of what was burning, and fought the fires until dawn while their bodies quietly absorbed more radiation than a human being can survive. 3 kilometers away, the city of Pripyat woke to a spring Saturday and simply carried on. Children in school, couples on the riverside, an amusement park being readied for the May Day holiday, while a reactor burned on the horizon and invisible fallout settled onto the streets. The evacuation was not announced until the following afternoon, 36 hours after the explosion. Then, in a single afternoon, a column of buses took around 50,000 people out of the city. They were told to pack for 3 days, and they never came back. 2 days after the accident, and more than 1,000 kilometers away, radiation alarms sounded at a nuclear plant in Sweden, triggered by contamination carried on a worker's shoes, and the secret the Soviet Union had not yet spoken crossed its borders on the wind. 28 of the men who fought the reactor that spring, operators and firefighters, Pravik among them, died of acute radiation sickness within 3 months. The graphite in the core burned for 2 more weeks, and in time, more than 500,000 people were sent to contain and clean what one night had scattered. Around the plant, an exclusion zone 30 kilometers wide was drawn on the map, and it is still there today. The reactors of that type were rebuilt from within, their rods redesigned, their fatal appetite for steam corrected. And when the full story finally surfaced, the world's investigators reached the conclusion the Soviet Union had resisted for years. The men in that control room had made their mistakes, but the machine itself was flawed, and the final trigger of the explosion was the emergency button that was supposed to prevent it. This has been the Countdown Archive. The archive holds more hours like this one, minute by minute.